The royal class was a special division within the temple, an educational institution created to develop the greatest talents across the empire. This class was composed of exceptional individuals, each with unique skills and aptitudes. They represented the most promising students in the entire nation. In other words, they were part of the top 0.1% of the elite. Such was the nature of that class. And within Class A, there was a student named Reinhard, who held the 11th position. Even so, he found himself confused, unable to understand if what he was seeing was real and how everything had happened so suddenly. The concept of infinite aptitude seemed completely out of the ordinary. No one understood how someone could be accepted into the royal class based solely on aptitude. They had never witnessed anything like it before. They received the boy named Reinhard with a certain sense of strangeness. He had the feeling of having been thrown into a monstrous class, and because of that, he felt discouraged. In truth, he had become the 17-year-old son of the Demon King as a consequence of the crimes he had committed in his past life. Although he was 30 years old, he had just enrolled in the academy with a single goal: to survive until the end of that collapsing world. He knew he had to act with caution when faced with those who tried to stop him. Even so, Reinhard felt he had no choice but to try. To move forward, he needed to grow stronger, and to do that, it was essential to accumulate achievement points. In any case, this was the world of a novel he himself had written. It was at that moment that the system introduced a new event, instructing him to do his utmost to survive until the conclusion of that story. In the past, a long war that determined the fate of humans and demons became known as the Demonic World War. This conflict between races came to an end when the hero Artorias defeated the great Demon King Valier in an epic battle. With the death of the Demon King, peace returned, but after so much war, great effort was needed to train new heroes and talents. Thus, an academy was founded for gifted individuals from across the empire. This institution was called the Special Educational Temple. The royal class was an exclusive group composed of the greatest talents within a school already filled with exceptional individuals. In this class, a boy named Luig stood out, righteous and temperamental, yet always ranked last. It was an action fantasy novel set inside the temple, currently available on CAC's page. However, the comments always claimed it was a bad story. Despite their patience, readers eventually abandoned the plot and asked the author to end the series. They considered it boring and childish and criticized the fact that all the girls in the story seemed blind, questioning how they could fall for such a foolish protagonist. They claimed the author didn't know how to write, as it was evident he followed no coherent plot, to the point that some wanted to rewrite it themselves. While reading those hateful comments about his novel, the author ended up dying of high blood pressure caused by stress. Later, an agent from the Soul Management Department of Hell, Reaper Kim, declared the cause as a spontaneous cardiac arrest brought on by hypertension. Now that he had just passed away, he needed to review his paperwork as soon as Kim finished confirming his status. The protagonist couldn't tell if it was a joke or not. After all, he had literally died because his blood pressure spiked from reading hateful comments about his own work. Kim and Sai asked how many more times they'd have to explain this situation. It seemed he still didn't understand even after seeing his own body. But despite not wanting to believe it, it was simply the truth. He was right there, looking at himself on the table. He remembered collapsing, and if that were his last memory before death, it would be incredibly depressing and pathetic. Kim said that now that the process was finished, he needed to hurry and make a decision since she was busy and had to move things along. Though it was shocking to have died so suddenly, he was now being forced to make a decision just as bizarre and abrupt. That's what the Reaper explained. When someone dies and wants to go to heaven, they must first atone for their sins. The sin he had committed was abandoning several series and writing stories with terrible continuity. He had lived as a writer, and although not awful, he barely scraped by with his writing. Therefore, his crimes were linked to irresponsibility and the frequency with which he dropped his own series. He'd retire easily of his poorly developed plots and start new ones as if nothing had happened. However, he had a despicable habit. He always started a new novel under a different account. The problem now was that everyone had to atone for their sins in different ways. Still, he couldn't understand how that really counted as a sin. Even if he wasn't proud of it, he couldn't grasp how that could be considered a transgression. The Reaper said that although it was a small sin for one individual, the problem was that it happened so often and affected so many people. Therefore, the scale of the problem was astronomical. The protagonist couldn't understand what kind of system this was. It seemed that, as an irresponsible writer, he had to atone for his sins. To do that, he would have to randomly choose one of his completed novels and be inserted into it, becoming one of its many characters. Then he would have to survive until the end. The moment this was presented to him, he immediately felt like he was in a real-life isekai. He wanted to scream, but Kim smiled, finding it hilarious when someone received a one-way ticket straight to hell. Besides, since it was his own novel, he could know the entire story and not have to worry too much. In truth, it seemed more like a reward than a punishment, and the protagonist replied that it really depended on which novel was selected. No matter how much he thought about it, none of the novels he had written had a happy ending. Among his completed works, the first was City of the Dead, a zombie apocalypse where all he could do was beg to be devoured quickly. The second was survive in a ruined world, a post-apocalyptic survival story. He couldn't imagine making it there considering he had died just from reading online hate comments. The third was The Hunter Became a Manager, a modern action story about monster hunters. There was a good chance that, instead of becoming a hunter, he'd just be a nobody, killed by a monster before even reacting. The fourth option was Somehow. The game became reality, but in that one, he was just a janitor. The title said it all. A fantasy dungeon game where at the start 90% of humanity dies in a system-imposed process to control reality. He simply had no confidence he could survive in any of the novels he had completed. Of all these options, only one seemed viable. The Demon King is Dead, a school story with a fantasy setting. It was a relatively calm story that he had written after growing tired of creating only intense narratives, and for now it seemed like his best option. Although he had died because of that novel, its post-war, school fantasy setting made the story less threatening. It was the one with the lowest chance of ending in his death. A novel where the final boss dies right at the beginning and the plot develops from there. That was without a doubt the best option. Since it was a random draw, he didn't even need to be the protagonist to live a decent life. He'd be lucky just to be another student at that school. Still, he wondered why the novel was considered bad. He remembered that something had happened midway through the plot. That's when Kim interrupted, warning that if he took too long, she'd choose for him. She especially liked City of the Dead, and immediately he begged to go into The Demon King is Dead. Kim sighed, agreed to his choice, and then wished him good luck, leaving him suddenly confused. She simply clapped her hands and the entire setting around him changed. When he saw his new appearance, he realized he looked completely different. He was in his room at that moment and wondered what kind of luxurious chamber it was, also noticing that he had horns on his head. He was wearing elegant clothes. It was shocking to realize he was really inside his own novel. He wished he could speak to the Reaper, even after being thrown there without any explanation. Suddenly, a status window appeared before his eyes. He couldn't understand what kind of cliché development this was. On the screen it said his name was Valier Jr., with standard attributes, and that he belonged to the archetype race. He had no talents but possessed the ability demonic domination. He simply couldn't understand any of it. It seemed he had become a low-tier demon king. The title of the novel was The Demon King is Dead, and yet now he was a demon king. Everything indicated that something had happened beyond his imagination, but it seemed there was no avoiding it. The random character he had become was not so random after all. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise, followed by a huge explosion that threw Valier far away. It was a massive shock to witness an explosion right before his eyes as the system initiated a prologue event titled Destruction. The defeat of the demon army was imminent, and even though he had no power, he had to do everything he could to survive. Valier's mission was to escape from the Demon King's castle. If he succeeded, he would earn 100 points. Right after that scene, a body suddenly appeared before him, and he noticed several monsters dying around him. To sum it all up, he had been thrown into his own novel. The joke demon died exactly as predicted. As a result of the random character selection, he ended up in the middle of the collapsing demon realm, as a character who had never even appeared in the story. At 17 years old and without any combat skills, he became the son of the Demon King, the very same Demon King who had been killed at the start of the narrative. Now he was Valier Jr., the prince of the ruined demon kingdom. Valier was running as the castle collapsed, cursing that damned Reaper for being the con artist who had tricked him. Although Kimmin had said he would become a random character in the novel and might even be rewarded, he couldn't understand why he had to be the Demon King's son. The reason the castle was falling apart was obvious. The Demon King and the hero were in the middle of their final battle. That was the prologue scene he had written himself in the novel The Demon King is Dead. In the story, both the Demon King and the hero died, and the war ended with a human victory. And now he was the demon prince, Valier. This meant that the moment he was captured, he would certainly be killed. As he ran, he stopped for a moment, needing to think. How could he possibly survive such a horrible situation? There had been a system window at his side for some time now, something he had never even included in his novel. But according to that cliché status screen, he was now Valier Jr., with certain available stats. He didn't know what the exact standard was, but he was sure they weren't high stats. Being a final boss like the Demon King would have been much better. He could have fled or at least tried to strike a deal. Anything would have been better than his current situation. Valier didn't have any special skill that could help him survive or escape. The only useful thing was being able to understand the language of that world. So his only option was to escape. He'd hoped to find something useful inside the storage room he had just reached. He entered, hoping to find anything that could help, but was shocked to find only junk in the warehouse. That was why they were losing to the Imperial Army. There was nothing there that could be useful. As he rummaged through the place, Valier suddenly found a book of magical scrolls. In the novel, he had written that even someone without knowledge of magic could activate it just by opening the scroll. So he opened the book and started checking. The things he was looking for had to be there somewhere. While searching, he found the teleportation scroll, a movement spell that transported the user to a specific location. The magical scroll was labeled teleportation, but with the castle being destroyed so rapidly, he would end up buried in the rubble. First, he needed to try to get as far away as possible, so he tried to use the teleportation scroll to get out of there. However, he ended up in the same place and wondered why it hadn't worked yet. Due to a movement barrier, the system notified him that the spell he had tried to cast had been immediately cancelled. Valier realized he was completely screwed in that situation. He didn't even have time to look for another escape method. He wondered if he should try begging for his life. Then suddenly, he found another spell in the book called Camouflage. Camouflage was a spell that allowed the user to change their appearance and disguise themselves as something else. The protagonist didn't know if disguising himself as a human would actually work, but he planned to try anything he could. He still had doubts if it would work. Even so, Valier Jr. decided that his escape plan from the Demon King's castle had officially begun. The first task was to use the camouflage spell to disguise himself as a human, sneak into the prison, and be rescued by the Imperial Army along with the other prisoners. Later, he could find a chance to escape, and his survival mission would be a major success. The best way for Valier to survive in that situation was to be rescued by the Imperial Army, so he used the disguise spell and entered the prison cells. However, he didn't understand why it was so quiet inside. He wondered if he had entered the wrong place. Then he stopped and noticed a horrible smell. It was the stench of blood, and he felt like he had stepped on something as he walked. He quickly realized it was a severed hand and fell backward, screaming. He had come into contact with the blood of a dead person. The protagonist froze before the horrifying scene. For some reason, all the prisoners were dead. He had never written anything like that in his novel. It was supposed to be a simple romantic comedy, and he wondered if he should just flee again. But Valier didn't even know what to do after escaping. He needed to do something. Then he realized someone was there. It had to be a survivor. A little nervous, the protagonist approached and asked if the person was okay. He saw that it was a girl sitting beside someone lying on the ground. She looked like a child who was terrified and shrank back as he got closer. He apologized for scaring her, saying it was because they were prisoners, and asked if she was alright. He sighed in relief when he saw that she seemed unharmed, but it looked like the person lying beside her was likely a relative. So he told her not to worry, that he would be rescued soon, and asked if she wanted to wait with him, if that was okay. But she remained silent, staring intensely at Valier. He realized he might have overstepped. It seemed like she found him suspicious. He laughed nervously because he was terrified. After all, this was the Demon King's castle. Maybe it would be better if they stayed together. The girl stared and began trembling, and he quickly apologized, realizing he might have asked too much, but still tried to explain himself. She wiped the tears from her face and finally said it was okay, asking him to sit beside her. But in truth, Valier found the situation a bit strange and remarked how calm she seemed. This made the protagonist let out a nervous laugh, saying it was scary for him too. Honestly, that wasn't a lie. He was really scared. After all, his plan had failed. He would be killed or captured instantly. It wasn't like he had other options. If he was going to fail, so be it. But then, as he touched it, he noticed something in his cloak. He realized there was something inside. Earlier, Valier had found it in the pocket of the clothes he was wearing and kept it with him. At the moment, he wasn't hungry enough to eat those cookies and started talking with the girl who had picked him up a little earlier. He asked if she wanted to share and offered her the cookie. She accepted after a brief moment of surprise. Valier was surprised. She must have been starving after being trapped there all this time, but for some reason, she was eating very little. He wondered if maybe she didn't like cookies, and said they just needed to wait a little longer. The Imperial Army should be coming to rescue them. Suddenly, they heard a voice shouting that the prison cells had been found, and Valier froze when he realized the men had finally arrived. Several men stormed into the cells and approached the two. One of them widened his eyes in shock upon seeing them. He was stunned. Valier didn't understand why they were reacting that way just because they had found some prisoners. Their reactions were rather strange. Then the man knelt, begging her Imperial Majesty to punish him for not arriving earlier to save her life. The protagonist turned, shocked, realizing that the old man had just bowed before the girl and called her Imperial Majesty. That girl was the first Imperial Princess of the Guardius Empire, Charlotte Guardius, and she had been placed in those prison cells. In the end, the protagonist's survival mission was a success, and he completed the prologue, earning 100 conquest points. Later, at the Imperial Army's military base, several soldiers were injured. Fortunately, being rescued alongside Princess Charlotte, who had been with him, ended up being a good thing. But the situation was complicated. Charlotte began eating an entire plate of food, and he was rescued by a noble who stood by the princess's side, who, by chance, was with him. In the end, however, he was still a demon deceiving others using a low-level spell called Camouflage. If the princess's mage happened to claim they might have been cursed by demonic magic and used Dispel, it would all be over. What's more, Charlotte had ordered her men to care for Valier first, since he was her savior. The princess was taking care of him way too well. In short, too much attention was being paid to him for him to slip away unnoticed. And there was one more thing. Charlotte de Gardiaz, the girl before him, was a character who had never appeared in his original novel. He had never written about her. During the meal, a man approached, apologizing for the interruption. Since they were at a military base, this was the best they could prepare for Charlotte to eat. She smiled and thanked Lance for his hospitality. Lance expressed his gratitude for her understanding and said that once Duke Salon arrived, it would take her back to the Imperial Palace. Charlotte thanked him, saying it was a relief, then smiled and thanked the protagonist for what he had done for her in the cell. Valier didn't feel like he had done anything and asked if just being there had brought her any comfort. Even so, the princess insisted that he had helped her greatly, and in return, she wanted to bring him safely to his hometown and asked for his name. Valier grew nervous, wondering how he should respond. A hometown, a region he wasn't even sure he had. He couldn't remember anything like that. However, Valier felt a piercing gaze directed at him. He realized it was Lance staring at him with a terrifying expression, so Valier answered that he didn't remember anything. Lance continued glaring at him like he was about to kill him just because he took too long to reply, so he decided to make something up. She was shocked and began to cry. Valier wondered how the princess could actually believe that. Was she too innocent or just an idiot? Saying something like that made Charlotte imagine that he must have suffered a great deal while imprisoned, which made Valier sigh in relief at how naive she was. Wiping her tears, Charlotte declared that he didn't need to worry about that anymore. She swore in her name that she would help him recover his memories. He bowed and thanked the princess, and Lance was shocked that Charlotte would make such a promise, but she was determined to fulfill it. She couldn't go back on her word and asked if they planned to let her become a liar. Lance stammered in denial, and although Valier felt like a liar, he was grateful for her intentions, even if keeping that promise was impossible. That's because Charlotte was going to die. In the original novel, there was no description of the prison conditions in the Demon King's castle. Some backstory he didn't know must have been automatically generated to give structure and realism to this world. If the existence of a princess was one of those realism elements, and Valier couldn't predict her future. He had never written her story, but he did know that Bertus, the prince he had created, would never allow living rivals to threaten his path to the throne. That innocent girl probably didn't even know her own fate. Her life was in danger, and Valier wondered what he could do for her, so fragile. In truth, the princess's death and his escape would make more sense. But he'd become a real scumbag for that. The protagonist wondered what kind of thoughts those even were. A child's life was at stake right now. He'd wish she would tell him that her life was in danger. If he could drive her away by doing that, she might be able to help if something unexpected happened. Sighing, Charlotte said she felt indigestion from eating too much and asked Lance to call a doctor for her. Lance stammered that he still needed to ensure her safety, but the princess asked what reason there was to still be in danger now that the Demon King was dead. Finally, Lance agreed with her and decided to go call a doctor, which made her thank him for his concern. Then Charlotte turned serious and began to apologize, which left Valier completely confused. She seemed like a completely different person now, especially when she said it was her fault that he would die. She couldn't reveal details of the imperial family, but she would probably be assassinated soon if things continued like this. But one responsible would be her half-brother, Bertus de Gardas. Most people at the base were probably loyal to him, and keeping her imprisoned meant they didn't want it known she had been rescued. Now that he thought about it, Valier remembered Charlotte had been covered by a thick cloak when she was rescued. People probably didn't even know there were survivors among the prisoners in the Demon King's castle. She knew they were likely just awaiting orders to eliminate her quietly. They could poison her and claim they had found her dead in the Demon King's castle. If Charlotte died like that, they wouldn't let the protagonist escape either. He'd be killed quietly to eliminate the evidence along with her. Valier stammered, asking if they should try calling for help in the chaos, but she replied that it would be pointless. There was no one she could trust, and the protagonist wondered if that included Lance as well. It was checkmate. However, Charlotte assured him that he didn't need to worry. After all, she had sworn to help him regain his memories. So she said they needed to escape from there. She planned to distract them, and Valier felt that they really didn't have much time. The protagonist ended up agreeing with her idea and ran off to carry out the plan. Even so, suddenly, he received an important task from the princess, and Valier was surprised to discover that she truly planned to escape. Charlotte said there was only one way to get out of there alive, and he asked how that would be possible. She replied that they needed to bring Sir Francis there, and Valier asked who that was exactly. She apologized, realizing she should have explained more. Charlotte asked if he remembered the knight who had saved them from the Demon King's castle earlier. Valier realized she was referring to that frightening guy from before and explained that William Francis was one of the few people from the neutral faction. He was loyal only to the imperial family itself, and Valier understood that he must be someone trustworthy. If he had been on the prince's side, both of them would have died at the Demon King's castle from the start. But Francis had saved them anyway, which meant he was an excellent knight, strongly loyal to the imperial family. Valier thought that if someone truly neutral supported Charlotte, he might also have a chance to survive. With that, the protagonist decided to follow her words, and the princess thanked him for believing in her, since now they could return safely together. Then, she suggested they could escape even with the increased security, and he asked how they would manage that. She began to explain the plan. First, she would act as bait, and Valier grew worried because that sounded dangerous. She admitted it was, but she would be fine, at least until someone arrived to decide her fate, so he needed to hurry. Charlotte held his hand as they didn't have much time, and Valier could feel her hands trembling. Given the situation, he agreed. He had no choice but to cooperate with the imperial princess, so she walked out of the tent in front of the guards. They told her it was dangerous, and that she should stay inside the tent, but Charlotte insisted that she wanted to see the barracks. This was a bit bothersome for them, but the princess insisted, saying she was the imperial princess and wanted to inspect the barracks. They had no authority to stop her. They kept insisting they couldn't allow it. Their duty as knights was to keep her safe, but Charlotte kept buying time. Valier managed to slip out of the tent unnoticed, but he wondered where Francis might have gone while he searched the base. Suddenly, a man approached and asked what he was doing. The protagonist replied that he wanted to speak with Francis. The knight said Francis had just left for the Demon King's castle and asked what Valier had to say to him. Valier froze, realizing the plan was ruined now that Francis had gone so far. The man explained that it was something Lance had requested. Francis had gone to deal with the remnants at the Demon King's castle, and the protagonist immediately understood Lance's intentions. He was the knight beside the princess. It was possible that he had foreseen the plan and acted first. So now there was only one option left. The knight asked again what Valier wanted with Francis. If he didn't answer, he would be reported, and the protagonist stammered because it was an emergency, catching the man off guard. He stammered, explaining that Francis was in danger. Valier wasn't about to let that man stop him over something like this. The knight exclaimed that they had to rescue Francis immediately, or at least that's what Valier hoped he would say. Instead, the man asked what the protagonist was talking about. Valier thought it would be very convenient if he believed him, like Charlotte had. Slowly, Valier replied that he didn't know all the details, but something involving Francis and her Imperial Highness was going on. For Charlotte's and Francis's safety, they had to bring him back immediately, although clearly someone like him had no reason to be trusted. But the man said he believed Valier, which shocked him, and added that he was saying he believed in nobody like him. The protagonist stammered, asking if he really meant it. He knew he shouldn't be saying that, especially since he'd given no reason to be trusted. The knight laughed, saying it was true, but if he had to give a reason. Maybe it was because Valier was so desperate that any stranger could see it. Valier grew nervous upon hearing that, but the man said he understood. Part of it was just intuition, telling him it was true. He also thought Francis might have foreseen something like this. When he told them to stay alert, he had mentioned someone might show up. Valier was surprised and wondered if Francis had known the whole time. He had always known what might happen to the princess. Even so, the protagonist questioned why he had left and gone to the Demon King's castle. Instead, he should have stayed by her side to protect her. The knight then said they should go and asked if he had ever ridden a horse before. Valier replied that he never had, but the man said there was nothing to worry about. His steed was excellent. With that, he turned and asked Valier to follow him. They could depart as soon as he found his horse. Valier had no choice but to speak directly with Francis. The man finally introduced himself as Dyrus, and the two set off, unaware that Lance was secretly watching everything. Dyrus rode with Valier on their journey, and along the way saw a demon being thrown into a cage by other men. The protagonist wondered why there were other demons and asked Dyrus about it as they continued riding. He asked why there were demons by the roadside, and Dyrus replied that they were prisoners. After all, a battle had taken place there. If they'd be captured, they were either defeated soldiers or non-combatants. All were being imprisoned. They were still investigating the areas around the Demon King's castle, and once they returned to headquarters, all of them would be executed, so there was no reason for concern. Valier replied that he understood, realizing that if he had turned himself in, the same would have happened to him. Soon, they were nearly there and would dismount. It didn't take long before some other knights noticed them approaching. One of them asked who they were. Dyrus responded, introducing himself as the leader of the 3rd platoon of the 11th squad of the 4th Regiment of Knights of the 1st Cater. The knight asked when Dyrus had been brought there. He replied that Valier had something important to tell Francis, and that's why he had brought him. Since it was a confidential matter, he had brought him to speak directly with Francis. The knight grew nervous upon hearing this. After all, they had just received a report saying that Francis had died in battle against the remaining demons. Valier froze, shocked by what he had just heard. They murmured among themselves that it was truly unfortunate he had vanished. If that were true, there was no one left who had stayed by the princess's side. At that moment, the knight questioned whether the message was something he should know. Valier denied it, saying it was a private matter for Francis, and the man dismissed them, stating that foreigners had no place there. Dyrus thanked him, but Valier began to despair. He realized that everything had been going too smoothly and finally understood why. The story about Francis being killed by rebellious demons was actually a hoax. Bertus wanted to eliminate Charlotte, covering up the fact that she had survived the Demon King's castle. As the princess had predicted, he wanted to eliminate any proof of her survival, even if it meant killing everyone who knew the truth, including Francis. Therefore, Francis had been taken to the Demon King's castle and murdered. Valier feared what could still happen to Charlotte, but he wasn't willing to give up. He needed to think about his next steps. It was then that Dyrus suggested he should tell the whole truth. The real reason he had said that both Francis and the princess were in danger made the protagonist hesitate and fall silent. He wondered if he could trust Dyrus. According to Charlotte, most of the military forces were on Prince Bertus's side. He didn't know how far the prince's influence reached, whether it extended to Dyrus, but he had no one else to trust. Thus, Valier ended up revealing everything that had happened while he was imprisoned with the princess and how Francis had saved them. Dyrus reflected on the story and said that if it were true, Francis would have been killed by knights, not in combat with demons. Valier agreed. He believed that was a very real possibility. Dyrus then wanted to know if he planned to rescue the princess. If so, that was fine. He declared that he also intended to save her. Valier was genuinely surprised. The man explained that he was part of Francis' group, so it made sense for them to join forces and trust the protagonist to keep Charlotte safe. Dyrus saying that brought relief to Valier. He still didn't fully trust him, but at least now he had support to escape. However, Dyrus emphasized that there was no point in staying at the Demon King's castle. They needed to return to save the princess. Outside, Valier finally had the chance to observe the Demon King's castle. Still, he asked Dyrus to wait as he had a good plan, so they decided to go back in. The knight acknowledged that searching the castle's supplies for useful items was a smart idea. When they arrived in the room, he noticed it had been a long time since anyone had been there, and Valier tried to appear calm, despite having searched the place earlier. Even so, there was a chance to find something valuable with a careful search. Dyrus commented that after the Demon King's death, the place was probably looted by other demons. Either way, they were all condemnable, selfish, and vile, and Valier tried not to react to the comment, even knowing he himself had stolen some things. He then suggested they take a look. It was at that moment he found an item, and Dyrus was surprised they had found something useful so quickly. Valier tried to play it off as he had already seen everything before, and they both noticed it was a teleportation scroll. Dyrus realized it was powered by demonic magic. Valier suggested they collect as many of those scrolls as possible, as they might be valuable. Pretending it was mere coincidence, he laughed upon finding a book full of them. If they organized them there, it would be easier to take them later. Dyrus, intrigued, recalled hearing that Valier was a prisoner. Even so, he wondered how he knew where the scrolls were. Soon they had gathered everything, and Dyrus commented that they should go back in time. He asked Valier if he remembered the path they had come from. As he pointed it out, the knight told him to be quiet and guided him in another direction. Valier was confused until Dyrus whispered that there were people nearby. Knights had entered the supply room. They were commenting among themselves that they had seen the two of them enter the castle. They called them rats hiding in the Demon King's castle. They were knights of the Saurian Duke. Dyrus muttered that the situation was becoming truly dangerous. It was Bertus' maternal family, one of the Empire's most powerful noble houses. They intended to place Bertus on the throne. That's why most of their knights weren't commoners, but high-ranking nobles. It was as the protagonist had described. Francis's death for disobeying Bertus was likely part of this conspiracy. If they tried to flee through that vast castle, the situation would get worse. The knights were confident they would find them hiding soon. Valier wondered if they could really locate them that quickly and how that was possible. That was when a night eye began to glow. One of the men stated he knew where they were, behind a stone statue. You could hear their breathing. Valier was stunned that they were being heard, and the soldiers shouted, claiming they knew they were hiding. One of them drew his sword and demanded they come out peacefully. Thus, Valier and Dyrus emerged from hiding with no choice. One of the knights commented that it was unfortunate the princess had dragged innocents to die with her. Dyrus exploded, calling him a scoundrel and asking if he didn't see how absurd it was to try to kill the princess. But to that man, it didn't matter what some random boy had to say. He didn't feel comfortable killing a young civilian, although he believed he was doing the best for the Empire's future. Dyrus told Valier to stay behind him. Valier panicked. After everything he had gone through to escape the Demon King's castle, now it seemed he would die there. He would die again. Not even a day had passed since he had lost his life due to high blood pressure. Suddenly, he noticed a gargoyle statue nearby. He remembered that in games and manga, those creatures moved at critical moments. And that's exactly what happened. The soldiers froze when the gargoyle began to move. The knight's commander was quickly taken down by the creature, which charged at them. Valier was confused as he had only thought that it might move, but he had no idea what had triggered it. Dyrus also didn't know the cause, but saw it as a chance to escape. He grabbed Valier's wrist, and the two ran. While the gargoyle fought the soldiers, they took the opportunity to flee and survive. They mounted a horse and rode away at full speed. Dyrus wanted to know why the gargoyle had moved, but Valier replied that he didn't know either. However, this was a lie, as he clearly remembered the status window he saw upon arriving in that world. It included a skill called Demonic Domination, rank E. Perhaps this was because he was the son of the Demon King. He was almost certain he had activated the gargoyle unconsciously using that ability, now at rank D. He just hoped Dyrus wouldn't grow suspicious. Even so, the knight commented that in the end, the important thing was that they had escaped alive. Despite that, Valier was still uneasy. They had almost died. Suddenly, Dyrus realized a new problem. Soldiers were pursuing them, galloping at full speed. They shouted that they had to catch them before they escaped the forest. The situation was becoming more difficult. Faced with this, Valier told Dyrus to hold tightly to his waist. The other didn't understand the plan, but the protagonist mentally begged for something useful to appear, because he didn't want to die there. Then he saw something crucial and without hesitation, pulled an acceleration scroll from the book, refusing to accept that as his end. He cast the spell on the horse, increasing its speed and creating a considerable distance from their pursuers. Thanks to the magic and Dyrus' support, who could hardly believe Valier could wield such a spell, they gained the upper hand. However, the relief was short-lived as an arrow grazed Valier's face. Now the enemies were shooting at them from a distance while continuing the chase. Dyrus commented that they wouldn't go easy on them. Valier then decided to use something more effective against the knights. He chose a spell that caught Dyrus off guard, who claimed it wouldn't work as knights trained in combat and horseback riding wouldn't fall so easily. Knowing this, Valier was fully aware of the magical resistance of the characters he had created. He had even written that they trained galloping in temples. In other words, it was useless to cast the spell directly on the soldiers. So he cast the illusion enchantment on the horses, which had no magical resistance. Confused, the animals suddenly stopped running. The knights couldn't understand why. Valier was satisfied to see the horses disoriented, unable to resume their gallop. Then he cast additional enchantment and paralysis spells on the mounts to prevent any further attempt at pursuit. He only had 2 spells left in the book, but when he looked for the mind control one, he realized their escape had reached its limit. Their horse was exhausted, and Dyrus warned that at this pace they'd be caught soon. While thinking of what to do, Valier saw something ahead. Chained demons. They were prisoners captured after the fall of the Demon King's army. Suddenly, he felt the same strange sensation as when he had awakened the gargoyle. Within seconds, one of the demons, an orc, broke the chains. Dyrus was in shock, trying to understand what was wrong with the creature, since it was running straight toward them. He feared they were about to die. However, the orc ignored them and charged directly at the soldiers who were still chasing them. The knights shouted, surprised to see the prisoners freed, questioning the absence of the guards. It didn't take long for the orc to start attacking them. Amid the chaos, Valier suggested they take the opportunity to escape. Dyrus agreed and mounted the horse again. Valier sighed in relief. Demonic domination had worked once again. Dyrus, however, remained silent, watching closely. This was far too strange. Receiving help from demons at such precise moments didn't seem like a coincidence. Still, he felt it was too soon to draw conclusions. The most important thing was saving the princess. Soon, they arrived at the military camp. Dyrus identified himself, requesting access to Charlotte's tent. The soldier in charge questioned his allegiance and mocked him upon seeing a mere lieutenant demanding an audience with the imperial princess. Noting the knight's silence, he challenged him again, making it clear that he wouldn't allow him inside, especially not with that boy. He declared he'd let it slide this time and ordered them to leave. Dyrus then muttered that it was time for plan B. He drew his sword and forced the soldier to move aside. Other guards approached, asking what was going on. He only grumbled that the plan had been discovered. Even so, he allowed Valier to proceed to save the princess. Upon entering the tent, the protagonist came face to face with 2 men beside Charlotte. Both stopped him, stating they were under direct orders not to allow any intruders. The princess was surprised, but Valier shouted for her to close her eyes. Then he cast a lightning spell, blinding the guards. He took advantage of the confusion, grabbed Charlotte's hand, and activated the mass teleport scroll, taking them to Guardium, the imperial capital. An intense light surrounded them, and the protagonist thus completed the prologue sequence. With that, he obtained the special skill Historical Turning Point. Charlotte de Gardes, who in the original timeline was dead, now lived. The future had been drastically changed. At last, the prologue came to an end. The imperial capital, Guardium, was the main setting of the Demon King is dead. Inspired by Sue, the protagonist's birthplace, Valier expected to feel emotional upon arriving, since he himself had described every detail of the city. However, he quickly realized he had been mistaken. It was impossible to have written about a place so vast and complex with such precision. He then reflected on how someone could manage to write something so grand. Trying to keep his composure, he reminded himself not to get lost in authorial musings. His priority at the moment was the imperial princess. Charlotte, confused by their teleportation destination, asked if they were really in the imperial capital, considering they had just left the demon camp. Valier concluded he would have to explain everything soon. He apologized for bringing her to Guardium without prior warning, revealing that Francis had already died upon their arrival. Charlotte, shocked, wanted to know if they had made it there solely with his powers. Valier denied it, explaining they had received help from another ally. That ally was Dyrus, who also appeared via teleportation. Both felt relieved to realize they were safe. Valier silently thanked the fact that Dyrus had escaped unharmed, admitting that had he delayed any longer, he would have died. Plan B had been created in case they couldn't infiltrate due to strict guard surveillance. The plan involved Dyrus distracting the soldiers, allowing Valier to rescue Charlotte and escape using one of the teleport scrolls. Afterward, Dyrus would use the other. Fortunately, one scroll remained, which secured his survival. Next, Charlotte wanted to know who Dyrus was. Bowing respectfully, he introduced himself as a lieutenant and said it was an honor to meet her. He then asked her to recount the recent events. In return, he detailed everything that had occurred: Francis's death, the infiltration of the Demon King's castle and the desperate escape from the Salon Knights. He mentioned that, coincidentally, a gargoyle had interrupted the knights inside the castle, while the frenzied demon created the necessary distraction for their escape. Furthermore, their arrival at the capital was due to a teleport scroll found in the castle, adding yet another coincidence to the list. Valier, if in Dyrus' place, would also find all of that extremely suspicious, especially since he always ended up at the center of problem-solving. The way Charlotte looked at him made it clear she, too, was suspicious, and it would be even stranger if she trusted him so easily. Raised in the cruel environment of imperial politics, Charlotte was used to doubting. Deep down, Valier preferred it that way. He knew that if he stayed close to her for too long, his identity as a demon would eventually be discovered. That's why, as they walked through the streets, he realized this was the perfect moment to distance himself. Alone, he faced an agonizing dilemma. He had already risked his life several times, and even after saving Charlotte, he couldn't be rewarded due to his disguise. On top of that, he was starving, yet no one would give him even a single coin. He regretted not having created a convenient ability, like allowing demons to sustain themselves on mana alone. At that moment, he received a system notification informing him that, with new traits, demons could now be nourished by mana. However, this ability required 100,000 conquest points, which left him stunned. The system congratulated him for acquiring the authority to interfere in the world of the Demon King is dead. His novel, considered a literary aberration, had been classified as a profane alphabet soup abomination. Valier felt both offended and surprised. It seemed the system mocked his failure while exposing painful truths. He was informed that his actions could alter the main storyline, and that he would start receiving conquest points as rewards for facing major events. Additionally, he could also earn points by completing challenges with a list updated periodically. Upon opening the list, he saw challenges like slapping the Emperor, 10,000 points, being imprisoned in Guardium, 1,200 points, escaping prison, 2,000 points, among others. The variety was so absurd that he wondered what kinds of challenges were still to come. As a reward for completing the prologue, he unlocked the special ability to use conquest points. The system now displayed options for spending points, altering world traits, acquiring talents, or changing story elements. He could also access a preview to see how his decisions would affect the timeline. However, he was warned that interfering with key events or major characters might be impossible or require an absurd number of points. Also, using the ability irresponsibly to the point of causing a trait collapse would make him fail. If that happened without being aware of the risk, there would be a penalty. Valier realized the situation was becoming more complicated, especially after learning that traits already added or existing could not be removed by the system. The system explained that he could alter world traits with conquest points, but key events were immutable or required many points. Moreover, any attempt to use an ability that caused a trait collapse would be penalized. The system even offered a simplified summary, designed for idiots who don't like reading, even if they were writers. And once again, Valier was irritated by its sarcastic tone. Still, he had to stay calm. It was a complex yet powerful ability that could be essential to his survival. Since he had a few points available, he decided to check what he could do at the moment. Suddenly, the system asked if he wanted to access the writer's advice. He could choose between clear advice and vague advice with the option of asking what the difference was. Choosing the vague advice, he received the following question: how were so many people kidnapped in the Demon King's castle? Confused, Valier didn't understand the meaning of the cryptic message. He felt he had wasted 150 points for nothing. On the other hand, the clear advice told him to go straight to the magic item shop. That did seem like useful advice. Up until then, the system had suggested he survive by selling the magic scrolls obtained in the castle. It seemed like a quick way to earn some money. Soon he and Val headed toward the Allegard commercial district. There, a man approached him with suspicion, asking who he thought he was trying to fool. Another laughed at the scroll pages he offered, saying he'd never seen such a creative scam attempt. A third suggested that with such artistic talent, Valier should study at an art academy instead of trying to con people. Everyone believed he was just a lunatic trying to sell forged scrolls. That was strange. The system had told him to go to a magic item shop, but clearly not to sell the scrolls. Reaching the fourth shop, Valier tried once more to sell the item, now even more exhausted and hungry after so much walking. He just wanted to finish the sale quickly. The vendor then asked if he could perfectly copy that scroll. Valier was confused. By the fire symbol, he deduced it was a fireball scroll. The merchant praised his drawing skills and proposed splitting the profits equally. Now, everything made sense. If he could deliver a copy by the next day, he would earn 5 silver coins, the man said with a mocking smile. It was clear the vendor thought the scroll was fake. Still, Valier agreed to try reproducing it. However, 5 silver coins were too little. He decided to try reselling it to someone else. Not trusting his copying skills, he began to worry about the possibility that a buyer might try to use it in an emergency. He didn't want that kind of guilt on his conscience. What was strangest was that no one seemed to recognize the scrolls taken from the castle. If they couldn't identify them, the only choice was to try selling the fireball scroll and be done with it. He visited another shop and upon entering asked if anyone was there. There was no one at the counter to attend him. The place was a mess, hardly looking open to the public. As he looked around, someone silently approached from behind. Turning around, he saw a woman smiling at him. She asked if he was a customer, what brought him there, if he needed a scroll or a potion. Valier replied that he was there to sell a scroll. She smiled, saying it was cruel to play such pranks on adults. Under her gaze, Valier grew tense. The young woman explained that she normally didn't buy scrolls but couldn't let him walk around with something potentially dangerous. She then offered 2 gold coins. However, she interrupted the negotiation and asked him to tell the truth. Valier didn't understand until she asked where he had gotten that scroll. She said it was a magical formula used exclusively by demons. The protagonist froze. He realized she was pressing him even more, demanding to know why he possessed such a restricted item. Magic itself existed. He knew that, but how it existed was something not even the protagonist could explain. How the spell was activated and the method of casting were details he hadn't specifically defined in that novel. Therefore, there should be no way to distinguish a human magic formula from a demonic one just by looking at it. Since the other merchants weren't mages and knew nothing about demonic magic, they assumed it was a defective version. But the woman in front of him had discovered the truth and was demanding that Valier answer her questions properly. She kept pressing, asking where he had gotten that scroll, and the protagonist found himself completely cornered. For some reason, the woman was so obsessively persistent that he no longer knew how to respond. So he whispered toward the notification window, asking if there was any way to make the girl ignore the scroll now. The notification replied that the setting would cost 3,000 achievement points. He muttered quietly that the notification was completely useless. The woman asked what he was doing talking to himself, and Valier wondered if he really needed to tell her everything. Then slowly he began to try answering, saying that he had gotten the item from the Demon King's castle. She shouted, asking if he thought that was a valid excuse, demanding the whole truth before attacking him. Valier gestured for her to wait, saying he would tell her everything as it really happened. And then he began to explain a bit of the situation to her. But the girl seemed to sense that he was lying. If he had rescued the Imperial Princess, he should have received an extraordinary reward or even a noble title. Valier insisted he was telling the truth. He had clashed with the Duke Syria's knights during the escape. Imperial Prince Bertus might even have wanted to kill him. She hesitated. The story seemed a bit too made up, the typical role of a protagonist. However, his acting had been flawless. After all, she herself was an expert in making up ridiculous stories, so she smiled and asked, sarcastically, if in the end the Demon King was dead, him or the Imperial Princess. It must have been hard for both of them to suffer under his command. Suddenly, she hugged him, saying, Valier must have worked hard until now and got nervous, not knowing what was going on. Valier, still confused, said he didn't remember everything very well. He was hungry, embarrassed, and just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. She then suggested that maybe he was carrying some kind of curse from the Demon King's castle. She proposed using a dispel spell. Valier panicked when she asked him to wait there for a moment, but he wanted her to wait. That was because if she dispelled the magic he had cast on himself, his true identity as a demon would be revealed. While he pleaded for her to stop, she simply cast the spell, and as he feared, his true form was revealed. Valier let out a nervous laugh, asking what, after all, had just happened. But the girl called him Prince and wanted to know if he remembered her. Valier had no idea who she was. Suddenly, she cast a spell in an ancient language. The protagonist was surprised to realize that she was a vampire. Even so, she kept asking if he really couldn't remember her. She didn't want to leave things like that. She said they needed to move to another place. If they stayed there, they would end up being discovered. She suggested they go to her room on the 2nd floor, where they could continue the conversation. Valier agreed, still stunned, not understanding what was going on. Already in the room, she said he must be hungry, but at least she had some snacks to offer. He thanked her for the kindness. She continued speaking formally, but her behavior became more casual, even after everything that had happened. Then she apologized for repeating herself. But it really seemed that Valier had lost all of his memories. He replied that besides being a demon prince, he couldn't remember anything else that had happened. And she said that was good. The fact that he had brought that dangerous scroll to her, among so many others, was an incredible stroke of luck. Then she swore to properly introduce herself, saying she was a member of the infiltration squad and guardian of the Demon King's army. She was Tuesday Elleris. Elleris declared that she would begin serving him from now on, and Valier wondered if he had arranged something before. He thought it was all new to him. Valier had already wondered before why a vampire would live in such a sunny and crowded place. Smiling, Elleris said she needed to live on a lot that included a shop to save on rent, so she had no choice. Valier felt sorry for her, but Elleris said there was something else he needed to know. There were more demons there than in the Imperial capital. Now that the protagonist stopped to think, she had already mentioned there was an infiltration squad. One member operated under the false identity of Count Argon Pontius. He was Surabar, a doppelganger. Another member lived near the Bronze Gate by the Iron River, a werewolf, a demon known as the Mad Dog of Iron. He was the demon who personally kidnapped the Imperial Princess. Sarkar was exceptional at transformation magic. Using his face-changing arts, he could easily infiltrate the human world, and Valier realized it was him who had kidnapped Charlotte. It was better to be very careful around that person, and the protagonist asked more about that so-called Mad Dog. She was a woman who led one of the gangs that ruled Guardian's underworld. Using her excellence in hand-to-hand combat, she built her own force in a short time. Valier couldn't understand what was going on with that group that was supposedly an infiltration squad. They seemed more like gangsters. Even so, he wondered how the mad dog of Irene managed to form such a large gang with her in charge. Elleris explained that at the moment, she was the one funding the infiltration squad during that period. At least Valier acknowledged that she was the leader of a large gang and asked what was the best method to make money. Elleris slowly said that she made money by selling candy to people, and the protagonist choked. In the end, they were all just a bunch of criminals. Finally, Elleris sighed because Valier had forgotten everything that had happened. But he himself was somewhat frustrated with the situation. Even so, she was relieved because the prince was safe. They could rebuild the demon world. But Valier refused. He had no interest in rebuilding the demon world. If they recreated the demon world, what would come next would obviously be another war with humans. Even having seen war only once, it was horrible enough that he never wanted anything like it again. And in the current situation, simply mobilizing the demons again would be an act of self-destruction. There was nothing they could do. Elleris asked how Valier could say something like that. He should rebuild the demon world as the demon prince for the future of the demon race. But Valier stated that the demon world was over, so he had no intention of becoming king of a nation that no longer existed. Following that logic, Elleris should also stop acting as a servant of a dead nation, which left her silent. Slowly, she agreed and apologized for taking such a shameful attitude. He must be very tired, so he should focus on resting for now. Before Valier could say anything, she simply left the room, and he wondered if he had been too harsh in saying those things. Now, Elleris for a moment seemed vaguely happy, but he didn't understand what was happening. Elleris, as a vampire, looked like some kind of noble of the night. Seeing her like that, Valier felt that she was incredibly beautiful. In the middle of the night, the protagonist called her and asked her not to call him prince anymore, which made Elleris apologize. In fact, he was curious to know what kind of person he used to be, and she was surprised by the sudden question. Stammering, she said that of course he was great, a source of great pride for all demons. But from her reaction, Valier realized something was wrong. Instead, Valier said he could leave it aside for now as he intended to sleep. They had agreed to meet with the other two members of the infiltration squad the next day. Then he realized that if he slept on the bed, she wouldn't have a place to lie down. But it didn't take long for her to lie down next to him. It was a sudden event. Elleris hadn't mentioned anything about sharing a bed like that. Since his reincarnation, he thought everything had been horrible. But now it wasn't so bad, and he even celebrated a little for being the demon king. Dawn arrived, and Valier departed with Elleris to begin their infiltration. The capital was extremely noisy. The resurrection of the princess, the soldier's sacrifice, and the death of the demon. Of course, people wouldn't stop cheering in celebration. The war was over. Everyone celebrated in the streets, shouting for the good of the Empire and the Imperial Princess. Meanwhile, the two of them turned their backs on the crowd and boarded the man's train. It came from the Alagard district, and they departed south toward the Bronze Gate. Thanks to the protagonist's transformation into an opportunist, they didn't have to walk from Yongan Station to the express bus terminal for Bono Hang Park. Now they had arrived at the lower part of the Bronze Gate, and Valier had to admit it was truly a den of beggars. But Elleris said they had no other choice. They were going to meet the king of the beggars and headed toward the sewers. Meanwhile, inside the sewers, someone already sensed something approaching when Elleris and Valier entered. She warned him to be careful, as it was still quite dark, and soon someone stood up, recognizing that Elleris had arrived. The person who appeared was a lawyer who bowed before the protagonist and greeted the prince, who stammered a reply. She was a girl, but he figured no one had ever said the prince was a man, so he should have expected something like this. The lawyer asked if Saravar would also be coming, and Elleris nodded. He was a busy noble, and had only given them advance notice. The prince had lost all of his memories except for the fact that he was a prince, and the lawyer asked if that was really true. Valier confirmed it. Even so, the lawyer sighed, saying it was a relief, but the protagonist didn't understand why she reacted that way. At the very least, he wouldn't order the lawyer to lift her skirt and act like a dog like he used to. And Valier wondered what kind of person this character used to be. Elleris laughed, saying it seemed like the lawyer secretly enjoyed that, and the lawyer, nervous, told her to shut up, claiming she had never said such a thing. Valier realized he must have been a real bastard in the past, but it was a shame he couldn't remember anything, so he apologized. Even so, she replied that it was all right. Valier said he knew the past couldn't be erased, but they could try to do better from now on. When he extended his hand, lawyer offered hers like a dog, quickly pulling it back in embarrassment, while Elleris laughed at how instinctive it had been. Despite that, Valier said it was all right. He would be more careful not to provoke her too much, even if the lawyer kept doing things like that. Suddenly, they heard a voice and saw someone running and shouting, having just seen that the prince was alive. He ran straight to Valier and hugged him so tightly that Valier almost fell over from the impact. Sarkadar cried, saying he had been terrified the whole time, and lawyer was shocked that he had run so much he was out of breath. Sarkar wept, saying the great and powerful demon Prince Valier Jr. had to stop the impure humans. Valier could barely breathe and asked him to let go. Then he remembered Elleris' earlier warning to be cautious around that guy with absolute loyalty to the demon king and the demon realm. He was more than ready to sacrifice his soul to rebuild the demon kingdom. When Valier tried to pull away, the lawyer grabbed Saravar by the hair to make him back off once and for all. After everyone settled down, they sat to talk, and Saravar declared that Valier needed to rebuild the demon kingdom because it had been destroyed. Saravar declared he must avenge the fallen king and build an even greater and more powerful demon realm. But the lawyer called it nonsense and told him to shut up once and for all, and Valier complied. Even so, he was just a useless little boy for such a grand dream. But Saravar asked what he meant by that, since he was the greatest and most powerful archdemon ruling over all demons. And Valier asked what was so impressive about that. The three fell silent as Saravar continued praising archdemons non-stop until Elleris interrupted him to let her speak again. She explained that the dark land where they lived was a relentless war zone where blood never dried. Long ago, humans began forming nations to change that. But without unity, they became different races, and the demons were destroying themselves. Until the day special demons prevented the Great War and united the Dark Land, this demon interfered with the minds of others. They gave him the title Artimon out of respect, and later this title became the name of the Demon King's species. Valier understood better now and asked what he was supposed to do, wanting to know if they had a plan for that. For now, Sarkar said he should focus on getting stronger, returning to the demon realm, and gathering all the demons. The protagonist replied that it wasn't the worst plan, but it was far too risky to do that right away. They were in the heart of enemy territory, the Imperial capital, and he would stay there to learn about human culture and customs and also formulate a strategy. Sarkadar cried with emotion. As expected of Valier, he couldn't hold back his tears at the prince's bravery. In reality, it was because there were mana trains and human society was much more convenient for getting things done. That's when Saragar claimed to have a brilliant idea and suggested that Valier enroll in the Empire's educational institution, the temple. Valier asked what kind of nonsense that was, but the lawyer and Saragar seemed to be understanding each other somehow. He could grow stronger and plant the seeds of revenge within the temple school, where the Empire's prodigies were trained. But Valier wouldn't be able to escape so easily. So he needed Elleris's help, who immediately responded that it was a great idea. Stammering, Valier said this was a problem because they didn't even know what might happen there. It would be dangerous if his identity was revealed. However, Sarah said it would be fine because with the doppelganger ring he was offering, Valier could change his appearance whenever he wanted. The Demon Kingdom was now in his hands, and Valier felt pressured by Saragar's intense gaze. And so it was decided that the protagonist would go to temple school using the false identity given to him by Elleris and Saravar. But there was a possibility of an investigation into the victims of Charlotte's kidnapping after the princess's return. As a precaution, the lawyer went to see Dabun, someone who would help them, and Dunn shook hands with the person who entered with the lawyer. He asked his name, and now Valier had become Ranhar, the blonde boy. Elleris explained that there was a risk of exposure if he used the name of the deceased demon king. The lawyer asked if he could use the name Screams of Hell. Servitor said he was too perverted, maybe even a great king, and Elleris replied that his real name sounded far less suspicious than those terrible ideas. Valier told them to stop or they'd never finish and suggested the name Reinhardt. He would change his appearance using the doppelganger ring, thus acquiring a new and false identity and appearance. With the help of the lawyer, he would attend temple school. The lawyer had already mentioned this before, saying she would take him to get his new identity. The next day, Dunn already knew she wanted to take him to the temple. The lawyer agreed, explaining she wanted to help that boy build a future. Dabin understood her intention, but still asked how they planned to pay the tuition, which caught the lawyer off guard. She hadn't thought of that. Don explained that with the current income, it would not be possible to afford the tuition at the temple school under those conditions. Valier realized he had forgotten that given the current circumstances, those beggars wouldn't be able to pay a full year of tuition at the temple school. The most prestigious educational institution on the continent was the Temple School of Guardians, as it was widely known, attended by children from noble families. If the annual tuition of the temple school were converted into dollars, the amount would be around at least 100,000. From the lawyer's side, it seemed evident that they couldn't cover this expense with their current earnings. If they reduced the amount allocated to the gang, maybe it would be possible to reorganize the situation. Valier wondered how they could call that a gang budget when all they did was sell sweets. He decided he would have to check on that later. The lawyer had already mentioned several times that if they made that decision, they would have to close the shop. Dabun also believed there was no other viable alternative to solve the problem. For that reason, Valier suggested they pay only one semester of tuition. The lawyer then questioned if he was considering applying for a scholarship or something similar. Valier confirmed he'd have thought about something like that. Now that the hero was dead, the Empire would soon begin looking for a second or third hero. So if he showed talent, they could afford to support his stay. Moreover, if someone stood out enough, the temple school itself would cover the expenses, regardless of the search for a new hero. Even though he was just a lower-level demon, he was still an archbeing. Valier stated that with effort and training, he was sure he could develop at least one talent. The lawyer responded that it was good to have such self-confidence, and if everything went wrong, he could still create a talent using his achievement points. Still, Dunn said the situation was complicated. They couldn't ignore the fact that the available funds were not enough to cover the tuition at the moment. Besides, the traffic at the Bronze Gate Bridge had decreased considerably. Because of that, income was falling, and Valier suggested it might be time to change their way of thinking. Don asked if he had any idea in mind. If customers no longer came to them, maybe it was time to go to the customers. A place with heavy foot traffic and an easy escape route in case something went wrong. The Mana Train. If they could sell toys there, children would throw tantrums until their parents were forced to buy them. Despite their flaws, the lawyer was surprised by the idea. It was really brilliant. Even Dabon agreed. He praised the lawyer for having an eye for this and said Valier had a promising future, asking him to ensure his entry to the temple school. Valier thought the lawyer was going to call him a scoundrel because of that. He couldn't allow that to happen and considered giving him a lesson. However, he preferred to extend his hand and suggest they do their best together. Shortly after, the lawyer acted like an obedient dog again, creating a strange and embarrassing scene. Putting that scene aside, later that night everyone gathered to drink and have fun while the protagonist remained in disguise. During the conversation, they commented on how much the lawyer had praised Valier, and he replied that he was happy to hear that. Dom proposed a toast in the name of the new family member known as Reinhardt. Everyone toasted the new member, even amid drinks and vomit, until the protagonist asked who the gang members they mentioned were. David laughed and said it was themselves. Valier reflected for a moment, but that didn't make sense. The lawyer made profits through the large organization built with violence and managed to finance the infiltration squad, a magic item shop, and even a noble. They seemed to live relatively stable lives. Valier began to suspect the lawyer was hiding something. Laughing, Dabon pointed to an intersection ahead, where there was a roundabout. It was then that they explained why they were called the Roundabout Gang. The protagonist laughed upon realizing the name had an unexpected basis, but still wanted to discover what they were really hiding. Suddenly, the lawyer appeared to reprimand them, asking if they had really given her that much to drink. She stared at Dabon, who froze before the intimidating aura of the young woman and questioned what he was doing there. Valier realized that this definitely was not a good moment. He was grabbed by the collar and taken straight to the interrogation room by the lawyer. Dom just watched as he was dragged away, leaving him in the girl's care. She complained that she couldn't take her eyes off him for even a second. The lawyer asked what he would do if he got drunk and caused problems beyond their control. While she explained that he couldn't act that way, she was interrupted by Valier, who wanted to ask a question. He observed that it must be difficult to sustain the infiltration squad's operations and at the same time pay the temple school tuition with only one income source. He then concluded that she must be relying on some additional resource to keep everything running. She hesitated to answer and said she had never mentioned it because she believed the protagonist already knew. She said it wasn't her intention to hide anything. Still, Valier asked if she did anything that could hurt people. The lawyer denied it but admitted that on certain occasions it could end up happening. To be honest, selling sweets was just a front for the group. The gang helped the Guardians Thieves Guild gather information disguised as beggars. Valier felt that, in a way, they were a fanciful version of the Howl Clan's Beggars Guild. It was almost funny if it weren't so strange. The lawyer said that if he took command, she could tell him everything. But she believed he didn't need to know so much. He could simply forget all that after entering the temple school. After all, if Valier managed to develop a talent and get a scholarship, it would be better that way. He wouldn't need to get involved with the Rotary Gang's money anymore. There was nothing left to do but sleep without asking more questions. All because the lawyer clearly didn't intend to say anything more. The next morning, they still had to go to the Imperial Capital's administrative office with Dabon. Getting an identity was even easier than Valier had expected. Don smiled, saying he had business there, so it would be simple. While in the city, Valier noticed the enrollment secretary of the temple school. Don commented that each time he visited, the building seemed bigger than before. It was impressive since it was still just the rich trying to enroll their children in the school, but that wasn't exactly what it seemed. Valier answered that it must be the counseling office. If someone took the test there and was recognized with exceptional talent, they could enroll without paying. Don understood that was where talents were evaluated, but Valier knew they still had to go elsewhere. So they headed in another direction. They waited while numbers were called, and when their turn came, Valier and Dabon went to the reception. The receptionist asked if they knew it was enrollment time, and Dabon got flustered trying to answer. Valier said they were there to pay the tuition and enroll in the school. The receptionist sighed upon hearing that. People like them always showed up thinking they could get in by paying just one semester. Valier asked if that wasn't allowed, and the receptionist laughed. Usually, in those cases, students tried to borrow money from others. To avoid that kind of situation, the school didn't allow enrollment with only half the tuition paid. Valier sighed, realizing he hadn't considered that possibility, and suggested they leave. But Dabon insisted they could at least take the test. After all, Valier could be a genius or have supernatural powers. She asked if the test cost anything, and the receptionist assured it was still free. Stein agreed, saying since they were there, it wouldn't hurt to try. Still, Valier and Dabon talked. Valier thought it was a waste of time. Dabon disagreed. She believed they only needed to do their best. Valier felt discouraged, but the receptionist asked him to place his hand on the detector. That worried him because there was a risk they could discover his demonic nature through arcane domination. Although he knew it was unlikely, as a precaution, he could activate the ring at the right moment. The receptionist, however, was surprised by the detector's reading. Valier began to wonder if he should flee. Dawn asked what was happening, and the attendant apologized, saying the device seemed broken and she would replace it. Debon joked, asking if maybe there was something special hidden inside it. Valier laughed, saying there was nothing like that. For now, it seemed they hadn't discovered he was a demon. She only said she would replace the crystal ball. Valier, however, knew his own attributes better than anyone. Soon, the receptionist brought another detector, a new one. She checked if it was working properly and asked him to try again. Valier placed his hand on the device. The receptionist seemed even more worried. Dabin asked what had happened, wondering if the device had broken again. The employee found it strange. She was sure the detector was working normally. She asked Valier to keep his hand there for a moment. He wondered if he had some ability that interfered with devices like that. The woman was shocked by the result. It was something impossible. The aptitude registered immediately caught her attention. Aptitude was considered an inferior form of talent. It was not enough to call someone a genius, but it could indicate great potential if well developed. Even though they didn't guarantee a spot at the school, the evaluation always revealed children's aptitude as a service. But when the receptionist showed the result, Yonhei was stunned. According to the test, Valier was born with aptitude for all things in this world. According to the results, the protagonist was capable of using divine magic and dark magic, something never before seen in the Empire. Dunn slapped Valier while laughing, satisfied that he had been right from the start. He was relieved. However, this was a problem for the protagonist, who did not want to draw attention. Later, even the lawyer was surprised by the supposed infinite aptitude. Davin tried to joke, saying they were facing a future member of the elite family, but he got punched and silenced. To Valier, that infinite aptitude seemed like a plot device to justify the course of events. He could follow any path with his achievement points: melee combat, magic, archery. Moreover, he could acquire any talent. As long as he had enough points, he could unlock them. That was why the world had given him aptitude for everything. Then someone approached to talk to him again. Don noticed that Valier didn't seem happy with the results despite everything. Valier said he was happy, he just didn't want to be a burden to the group. Dabin bragged, claiming it was all thanks to him. After all, without him, Valier would never have discovered his abilities. As Dabin walked away feeling like a genius, Valier realized he was about to enter the main plot. The original plan was to enter as an ordinary student, accumulate achievement points for one semester, and only then draw attention. But the way things were going, he would be placed directly in the royal class. This was the temple's elite group, students with permanent scholarships, luxurious dormitories, and heavy financial support. They were considered the Empire's greatest talents and could attend any class without restrictions. Not even Valier expected this. Even Elleris was surprised. Class A was the peak of the elite within the royal class. However, Valier didn't seem at all excited. Elleris noticed and asked if something was bothering him. On second thought, Class A would soon become the target of ridicule, and that worried him. In the novel The Demon King is Dead, the protagonist was Luig, a student transferred from Class 1B. He rebelled against the arrogance of Class A, who despised the B students, and formed bonds with his classmates as he grew. In other words, most of Class A was made up of arrogant and egotistical youths. Infinite aptitude was something that left Valier torn. It was good to be highly rated, but it also brought enormous pressure. Elleris tried to reassure him, saying he would do well, and Valier smiled, already imagining the villains he would face in Class A. Aptitude alone would not be enough to survive. Elleris promised they would help him as much as possible. The temple allowed students to leave the campus. Valier then asked why she wanted him so badly to go to the temple. Elleris hesitated before answering. The protagonist said that if he became as powerful as Surabar wished, he might change his mind and start a war. Finally, she revealed she believed that if he spent enough time with humans, he would end up learning to love them as well. Valier asked if she wouldn't regret that later. She said she would deal with that problem when the time came. For now, she had prepared some clothes for him. She snapped her fingers, making a suitcase appear. Valier would need more than just his school uniform. Also, she offered him a red stone necklace, placing it around his neck. She asked him to keep it with him. Valier asked what it was. Elleris then asked if he remembered when she referred to herself as Tuesday. Valier remembered. It was the first time you went to the shop, and she nodded. Long ago, there were 7 vampire clans called the 7 Knights. The Monday and Sunday clans had disappeared, their magics forgotten. But the remaining 5 preserved their elements and traditions. The item she gave Valier was a treasure of her clan. The symbol of the Tuesday clan leader, its flame. The protagonist asked if that meant she was the leader of the Tuesday clan, and Elleris confirmed. He questioned why she would give him something so important. She explained that just as Sar's ring had the power of doppelgangers, the necklace allowed the user to channel fire magic according to their magical reserves. She encouraged him to try it. Valier was surprised by the power of that small red stone. He stood and tried to cast a fire spell, but, to his surprise, the power was weak as a flint striking a stone. Elleris explained, the more resentment he felt towards someone, the stronger the flame would become. That was why she gave him the Tuesday flame. She didn't want him to hurt anyone. And of course, she was also worried about her own safety. Valier thanked her. He promised to keep that in mind and not use the necklace until he graduated. Elleris smiled, grateful that he understood. Then the lawyer also offered him something. For a moment, Valier didn't know what it was, but she explained. It was a pouch with the amount in his allowance. The money was originally meant to pay the tuition, but since he got a scholarship, he could use it however he wanted. Unlike the others, the lawyer only had money to offer. Valier thanked her, promising to use it wisely. She wished him a good night's sleep, and Valier was a little annoyed at being treated like a child. Then he remembered an important detail about that novel. The story of the Demon King is Dead was originally about everyday life. A light narrative, made to please readers tired of sad endings. But the author had no talent for concluding a happy story. He ran out of material quickly, and the story lost its way. That was when everything changed. Near the end, a portal to another world opened, releasing thousands of monsters. The world collapsed, and Valier finally realized, if the story really followed that path, you would be in serious trouble. Knowing that Valier was wondering what to do, maybe he could take the opportunity to run away. He could run away and wait for the end to come. However, he wondered why he had to suffer for his own stupid decisions. When he thought about escaping, he remembered those who had tried to take care of him and felt that he needed to pull himself together. No matter what happened to the world, he was the one most responsible. He had to take responsibility. He needed to go to the temple and get stronger to earn even more achievement points than he already had. After all, he would need to use the review to prevent the portal from opening or to fight all those monsters. Whether it was the destruction of the world or anything else, he needed to do something to fix the situation. Time passed, and soon an announcement was made for the new students of the temple, instructing them to prepare their student IDs and the admission letter. The new students of the royal class should be present at the dormitory by 1 p.m. Valier was stunned. He only realized this when he arrived at the capital. Thinking that his lazy descriptions had materialized like that was impressive. He wondered how much money they had spent on all that. Inside the building, it was even more impressive than usual, and he wondered how he would find his room in such a large place. While walking, suddenly a girl approached him to talk. She recognized him as the new student, and Valier greeted her. She introduced herself as Sir Owen, the president of the royal class. Stairs knew he was probably looking for his room and asked if she could help, requesting to see his ID. Valier handed it over, and she saw that his name was Reinhardt without a surname and that he was part of Class A. He had been assigned to room A11. She explained that he should go in the opposite direction, towards the class hall, and reminded him of the announcement he had heard. There would be a welcome party for the new students at 1 p.m. Attendance was mandatory, as they would explain the rules that freshmen should follow. Valier thanked her for the help, and the teacher began helping other students. Then he headed to room A1. It didn't take long to find it, and he used his identification badge to access it, as instructed. He was surprised and wondered if that was some kind of magic too, although such things hardly surprised him anymore. What would his room be like? He couldn't remember anything. He didn't usually write down things with such small details. However, he was taken by surprise as the room was huge and luxurious, even bigger than he expected. He wondered if all students had rooms like that. First, the imperial capital, then the temple, and now the room. Everything was so fascinating that it almost seemed scary. Suddenly, Valier noticed a wrapped present. He opened it, wondering if it was for him. There was no way they had paid so much attention. He decided to check what it was. Inside, there was a map, the dormitory rules, some sweets, a notebook, and a pen. It was surprisingly kind. He still had some time and could memorize all the rules and the items he should use there. While writing, he tried to remember things about classes A and B until an announcement was made, informing that all new students needed to go to the main hall. Valier was surprised as time had passed quickly. He could only clearly remember the names of some characters, but that should be enough. He already had things more or less organized in his mind to know who was who, and soon the protagonist went out to meet the other students. Even with all the preparation, he could only recognize some of them, and he got a little nervous until he noticed some veteran royal class students watching from above. They all had terrifying expressions. He was surprised to see how many had shown up, and it was a considerable number. No one would imagine that the veterans would be interested in the new students, and Valier wondered why they had come. Suddenly, someone stepped hard on the protagonist's foot, and he fell to the floor in pain, turning to complain because they should have been more careful. But he was taken by surprise when the person bent down to apologize and check if he was okay. The person helped him up while still apologizing, but Valier was too stunned looking at the guy. After all, it was Ledwig who introduced himself with a smile, and the protagonist used the name Reinhardt to introduce himself. Ludwig and Valier shook hands, and the protagonist tried not to get too tense while looking at the main character of his own story. Ludwig noticed that the welcome party would start soon, and it was when he saw Ludwig that Valier finally felt for the first time as if he were inside his own story. Sears announced over the microphone that the event was about to begin and asked all new students to sit in the center of the hall. Class B should have 10 students, but now he saw 11. It seemed they adjusted the numbers because he entered through special admission. But the idea that Valier would be the last and from Class A made him nervous. He could already imagine the students pressuring him, wanting to know if he was the guy with infinite aptitude. He was that guy with all the fame, but a fragile body. People probably wouldn't even believe that someone without any visible talent had managed to get into Class A. He was sure that this exact scenario would happen. It was the perfect scenario for something like that to occur. Soon Siri said they should start the introductions, and Valier felt that he would be better in B11. The first person to introduce themselves to everyone in Class A1 was Bertus de Gardas, which was a complete shock to the protagonist. Originally, he was supposed to enroll with a fake identity, but there he was. And another girl introduced herself as Harriet the Saint O1. There was also Kara, who was 810 years old, and finally Valier introduced himself, still using the name Reinhardt. Around him, people whispered about him being the guy with infinite aptitude, not understanding how someone could get into the royal class just with aptitude. Valier sat down again after his introduction, trying not to feel nervous. Everyone was gossiping too much, which was incredibly embarrassing. Suddenly, a character appeared, which shocked the protagonist. The person who introduced herself as B1 was Charlotte Gardius. Originally, she shouldn't have been there. Hey everyone, did you enjoy the story? I really liked it. If you want to follow the next part, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you in the next story, guys.